Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Renee, and I'm the marketing assistant here at PCS Edventures. PCS Edventures is a leading provider of STEM education, curriculum, and materials, and today we'll be presenting Exploring STEAM Funding Options, presented by Suzy Hailslip, Jim Schmidt, and an expert panel. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel on the right side. I'll bring those questions up at the end during our Q&A segment. Without further ado, we'll turn the time over to Suzy Hailslip. Suzy is a STEM education veteran with over 18 years facilitating STEM integration in K-12.
Thanks, Renee. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited to be speaking with you all. And joining me to talk about different funding options are expert panelists. First, we've got Dr. Jim Schmidt, who has over 30 years of experience in public education as well as administration. Also, Dr. Kaitlin Maguire. She is a grant writer and iSTEM coordinator for the Idaho STEM Action Center. We also have Wendy Weisbart. She's a professional development genius at Collaborate, Communicate, and Celebrate. I think I said those in the wrong order. And then last but not least, we also have Shawn Petty, and he's the Training and Development Manager at WestApp. So before we get started, we just wanted to share a little bit more about PCS Edventures. PCS Edventures has been around for about 30 years. We started as an after-school center in 3 different states. We offered engineering and robotics workshops for students, and along the way, teachers kind of caught wind of these different workshops that we were offering and said, hey, how can I do this in my classroom? And so we thought, you know, that's a really great question. So we ended up changing our business model and putting together what are now considered the PCS Edventures Learning Labs. They're basically a turnkey solution. They offer STEM curriculum, all the materials needed to serve up to 30 students at one time. And we cover a lot in the after-school market, but rapidly STEM is going into the regular school day. And so we are tackling regular classroom time as well. As a STEAM program specialist, I've worked closely with educators and many different funding institutions to ensure that students have access to STEAM curriculum and materials. And today we're going to be able to share some of these different options for you. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jim Schmidt.
Thank you, Suzy. It's great to be here. We're very excited about sharing some ideas on how STEM programs can be funded. But before I start that piece, there's one thing I want to add to what Suzy said about the PCS Edventures kinds of products, and that Alan Friedman, who is a National Science Museum coordinator and also served on many, many committees at the national level, had a saying that he said one time, and I can't help but think about it every time we talk about STEM and what it should be, because his phrase that he used was always hands-on, minds-on, hearts-on. And that really kind of sums STEM up to me, because it's such an important component of what we do and how we can make education fun and exciting, as well as meaningful to kids and to our communities, and even more so to our business community. So with that in mind, the whole idea of this workshop is to try to find some funding sources that you might be able to access to help build your own STEM program. And there are some that come to mind almost immediately that we all think of, and that is the governments that we all fall under in our own states. There are many state organizations within the state through the Department of Education, Division of Technical Education, and those kinds of programs and government entities that are all under local education agency funding groups. So there may be sources within your own district that you haven't thought about as it relates to Title I, because every school district has many, I shouldn't say every, the majority of the school districts get some sort of Title I funding, and that's based on their school and free and reduced lunch programs, the low economic standing of the students that they have in their populations. And that funding drives a lot of different resources, as well as it also drives the Carl Perkins Funding Act for technical education at the secondary level. So there are some local LEA organizations and funding streams that might be accessible that you may not have thought about, but it never hurts to ask that question. And I think the one thing that will come across today during this entire workshop is that the hardest part of anything is just getting started and having the courage to ask the question or to start. And you'll probably hear that over and over today, but that's good advice, because I don't think you can hear that often enough, because it's a daunting kind of activity and challenge to try to get started. So it really is important for you to try to do that.
And I think even just attending today's webinar,
yeah, it's
right,
a start. Everything is a start. You have to start somewhere. This is a great start to do that, because you're going to get some feedback about local organizations, local school district funds. And you should, on the screen, you have some different local businesses that might be eligible to even approach for funding. These some of the larger businesses, but even smaller businesses, and I think this will come up later too with Kaitlin, the idea of service organizations within your community, regardless of how often have Rotary clubs or Kiwanis clubs, some community organization that is local, and they love to have projects that they can help schools with and help deliver services to kids. And really, there isn't a more viable group of people, because they're out in the real world and they can see the need for good, solid employees in the future. So anything that they can do to help build that workforce for them is really a real benefit to them. So they're usually very open to those kinds of funding streams and activities that you might want to access. There are a lot of other alternative sources, and they're listed on the screen that you can just, and these slides, by the way, will be sent to you at the end of the training, so you'll have them to adopt to. And the most important thing is that it gets started. And I understand that totally. The grants that I've written, sometimes I think I need to do this. I know I need to do this, but where do I start? And the main thing is just to sit down and start writing down your plan and what you're going to do, what you need, how it's going to get done, and just then start thinking about the different organizations that you might want to tap into. So that's just a good overview of where to look for some funding. I'm going to turn it over now to Kaitlin, and she's our resident expert.
No pressure.
No pressure here. But it's great to have her on this panel, because she really is a true asset to the state of Idaho. And she's very interested in what kids need and what Idaho needs and what employers need. And so with that very brief explanation, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm with the Idaho STEM Action Center, and we're actually a state agency under the Office of the Governor. We started in 2015, and really it came through legislation with a group of industry leaders, educational organizations, and government agencies who said we need a statewide STEM program or STEM agency. And so that's how the Idaho STEM Action Center came to be. We're kind of unique in that way, but each state has something going on with STEM, whether that be a statewide agency or local groups. So I encourage you, if you're not in Idaho, to research a little bit more about this structure in your own state and see if there's funding opportunities through those state agencies. So Idaho is lucky enough to have the Idaho STEM Action Center. So we do a variety of things, but primarily what we do is we provide grants for educators and schools. We do a lot with professional development. So we run workshops that are STEM focused, and we partner a lot with PCS Edventures to get equipment for those workshops. And then we also do a lot with student competitions. So we try to provide support for students to do science and engineering fairs or invention conventions. And then lastly, we just try to raise awareness about STEM and the value of STEM education. We see STEM education in the eye of workforce development, because Idaho's industries are changing and tech is really growing in our state. So we focus our educational efforts in STEM with an eye on workforce development in the future. We have a variety of grants always open, so I encourage you to visit our website. Currently, we have grants available for camps as well as professional development opportunities, such as our iSTEM program, which is a 4-day workshop offered throughout the state. This is open to Idaho educators, both public and non-public, but also formal and informal. So we see the value in informal education and a seamless education process for students in and out of school. The other hat I wear at the STEM Action Center is actually to write grants. So even though we are a state agency, we are always looking for additional funding to further support our program and expand our reach. So on this slide, I just put together my go-to locations for looking for grants. So we already talked about the federal, state, but you can even get down to county and city grants. I also look at the Foundation Directory, which is an online resource. You do have to subscribe to it, but most local libraries have a subscription. All libraries in Idaho have a subscription to the Foundation Center. And this online directory has every foundation across the country. You can search by location or by interest area, and they also list available grant opportunities at the time. Other online databases I look at are listed: Philanthropy News Digest, the Grant Station, and FundsNet. You can actually subscribe to be on their email lists, and they'll send you a monthly email, I think it is, with opportunities. But you can also go onto their databases and search by education, science, and then within that, science education or math education, wherever you fall. I also put up the Idaho STEM Action Center resource portal. So as I'm looking for grants, if there's anything I think is appropriate for an educator or school to apply for, I put it into our resources portal. So that's not just Idaho, that's nationwide. I put it in there. So keep your eye out on that. If you yourself have a grant that you'd like to share, we have a add a resource button on our resources portal, so you can share that with the larger community. And then I also look for professional groups, which was mentioned earlier. So you might have a local engineering professional group or a local computer science group. They are very invested in that workforce development, so I encourage you to check those out. And then I also look for local corporations or businesses. Something that the Idaho STEM Action Center looks for a lot with potential grantees is whether they've gone out and partnered with other organizations. We actually have a grant opportunity. It's called our public-private partnership, where if you have partnered with a local business or agency and have funding, we would like to work with you and match that funding. So that is a good strategy for showing potential funders that you are active and looking for other partners. And then lastly, I just put community groups like the Rotary Club that was mentioned. You'd be surprised once you start doing your research what groups are out there.
Yeah. I think the thing that Kaitlin really stresses too is that collaboration with other partners. Of all the grants that I've ever written and have received, there was always a component in that grant that talked about who are the stakeholders and who are you partnering with to deliver what you want to do in your school. So the more partners that you have, the more likely oftentimes that you'll have a shot at getting a grant funded, because they can see that you're really committed and that the community is committed to providing that service as well.
And the partnership doesn't have to be monetary.
No.
A lot of the times, businesses especially want to provide in-kind support. So that's providing their time. Through mentorship, this is a really good way to have those businesses get involved in what you're doing.
And even some government agencies too. I know with grantees that I've worked with through the Idaho STEM Action Center, they'll go out and partner with police stations and police departments in order to learn how to fly drones. And that is a huge piece of it, because it also introduces some STEM careers. So that mentorship really provides a great opportunity not only to secure funding, but to also get people to work within the program that are already experts in that area.
The other activity too that oftentimes can be helpful is the idea of having an advisory committee to help you with determining what your grant should look like and having a team of people working on it. I know in the technical education area, every program is required to have a technical advisory committee. And those people like to come in and speak to the classrooms and provide field trips, whatever the case may be. But in that process, we always see funds somehow flowing into programs that we had never anticipated because they get so involved in it that they can hardly wait to get their hands on stuff in those classrooms. So.
And I think now we are going to turn it over to Wendy Weisbart, and she's going to give a more of grant approach from the national.
Perfect, and that's what I was going to say. It's like a great handoff. That collaboration piece is definitely what I'm about. I've been known to be the out-of-the-box funder. I'm the one that has the Rotary Club funding some of our programs, the nail shop paying for our field trips, Home Depot giving us our supplies for our birdhouses, and brings the entire community together. Although the national and the federal and the state are all necessary funding, I think there are a lot of missed opportunities right within your community. So I like to say it's about the relationship building. The first thing you have to figure out, as you've heard, is how to get started. Where should you go? What should you do? What is your ask? Actually, what's your purpose? Once you figure out where you want to go, it will be much easier to find funding opportunities. You have to figure out how long you've been around, how you've grown. You heard Suzy talk about the partnerships. The partnerships are extremely important. Partnerships don't just happen overnight. That's something that you have to work on and build within your program. Another thing when you're going for funding is you always want to mention why you're unique. Why should you receive the funding rather than another agency? What makes you stick out within that community? And as you're figuring out these questions, it once again can be overwhelming. So target in a project or target something specific with where you're looking for that funding and what you're going towards. As you do that, you're going to figure out a purpose. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. Perfect. And you're going to be researching your funders as well as them researching you. It is a give and take relationship. You're going to find out what they do fund and what they don't fund. The worst thing is working really hard to figure out that you want to do this amazing imagination station and you need all of these materials, and then you get awarded and you find out that there was a line on page 57 that states that you can't use your funding for that specific thing. So you need to make sure that you do your homework. Figure out who you want to work with and why you want to work with them. Also mention some of the things that you've already been involved with. You have to understand all of the requirements that come along with it. There are multiple mini grants out in the world. That wonderful list that was provided for you earlier, a great one that has been known in Wyoming that I work with is Target. They do mini grants for specific project-based learning situations. So you want to find out if it is right for you, if the amount of requirement is something that you can handle, as well as the fit with the relationship. If for some reason you do not get funded, most opportunities will give you a reason or a why. Make sure that you continue that relationship with them. There are many grant opportunities or many funding opportunities that come around in cycles. For example, if you don't get funded this time because they were looking for STEM specific, maybe next time they'll help fund your cooking class or something that's going on within your area. So you want to make sure that you continue that relationship as you are seeking the funding. Most importantly, there is no such thing as free money. I know we would all love to have free money coming our way. It does not exist. These are grants. Yes, they can be gifts, but there is an accountability piece that will be on your end. Make sure you don't bite off more than you can chew. Meaning that there is purpose in what you're doing. Once you know your ask and you know your funder, you start that relationship. And just remember that when they're handing it over to you, you will have requirements that go along with it. But I always like to say those requirements should be accomplished rather than just be a box that you check, because you can take your positive results from one funding source and use them to get your message out, to brag across the United States with what you have going on. All it takes is a conversation. I like to joke and say the poor people that sit next to me on a plane, because I'm the one that's going to say, oh, what do you do? How do you do it? What happens here? I have been known to get an agency to pay for field day t-shirts from a poor gentleman that sat next to me on the plane. So don't be afraid to tell your stories. It's that accountability piece. And along with that accountability and the data that comes along with it, you always want to include your thank yous. Thank yous go a very long way. So as you move forward and you dive into the funding resources, you're going to realize that you want to treat it as a business transaction. It is what goes with it. It's built on relationships. It's about having that conversation, knowing your ask, and being willing to tweak your ask, because they may have funding available for something that they need on their end. You can switch your program to make it fit for everybody involved. When we talk about after-school funding and we talk about meeting the needs of the individual students, yes, funding is a huge thing, but if you are creative with it, as was mentioned earlier, in-kind funding goes a long way as well. It doesn't necessarily always need to be the huge $100,000 grants that you're going after. So piggybacking on what my other panelists have said, definitely dive in, don't be afraid. You won't know unless you ask. And the worst thing that can happen is that they could say, oh no, not right now, we don't have that. Okay, well, that's great. I'll be back in 3 months. Nice talking with you. Great to see you. And sometimes it takes a while to set that relationship. But those long-term relationships will come back around and help you surprisingly within your programs.
Well, it definitely helps plant that seed. That's a must. I know with the Micron Foundation, typically, especially here in Idaho, I'll have my customers call them and say, here's what my project is. What do you think about it? And exactly what Wendy was saying, they may say, that's not really within our interests right now, but at least you know ahead of time what they're looking for. And exactly, ask that question. What's the worst thing they can say? And I tell this to even my daughter every day. They can just say,
completely about educating. Yeah, you have to educate your community. Invite people in to see your program. Let the kids do the talking. That's what I used to say. Let them showcase what the need is there. Another big one, Starbucks. They have to donate their swag. If you have a relationship with the corporate, you can get a relationship with your regional person. We know that you can't use federal dollars to appreciate staff all the time. It's just another way of doing it. For supplies, Walmart, they have things that they have to zero out. So if you have that relationship with your local Walmart, you can go there and pick up supplies as well. So I think it's about educating your community, involving your community. As I stated earlier, I have had the nail shop pay for field trips. Guess who goes to the nail shop? The parents of the students that we're working with. It is a community investment all the way around.
that's great. I love that.
You know, it's so funny when, as I'll say, when you're the third panelist or the third segment, it's always fun because everybody sets the stage for you. So you get to come in and kind of pick up. But I love what's been said today, because if you're on the webinar, what you're really hearing is kind of grants 101, like a foundation of fundraising and funding, period. It starts with understanding the big picture of what's happening in the nation, what's happening in your local state, in your local area. Then it goes down to finding those databases that you can tap into, whether it's Grant Station or it's the Foundation Directory or even Youth Today. If you have a subscription to Youth Today, they have a database that you can access, grants database that's really good. And then Wendy kind of came home and was like, it's really all about, going down to the relationship base and building that relationship. So what can I add to that, right? Well, my comment is don't forget about policy. So, we always talk, when we talk about fundraising or funding for STEM, we always talk about the hard cash. Show me the money, like what can I get? But a lot of times there's a policy discussion that we have to remember as well. So a lot of initiatives occur because of a career need or an industry need. So if you think about STEM, and why is STEM such a hot topic, and why is it something that we focus on? Besides the fact that it's really fun and cool and you get to do amazing stuff with STEM, it's also something that our nation needs. 3 out of 4 jobs coming up is going to need computer science in the next 5 years, if not more. Back in the 60s, we had the space race. We're kind of going back into another space race, whether it's if you've heard about us going to Mars or you've heard about us building flying cities in Venus. I think Elon Musk even sent his Tesla off to Mars already, right? So there's all this stuff happening, and it follows career needs, and that's where the funding's going to follow. And it's up to us to find those policy pieces to tap into. Something to be aware of is even though policy shifts with federal administration, even state and local administrations, it's amazing how initiatives continue. So for example, regardless of your political spectrum, in today's world, the STEM focus has kind of changed a little bit. If you go to the Department of Ed and you look up STEM grant funding, you're going to find it under the Green Strides Initiative. So we were discussing this yesterday as we were preparing for this. I was like, it's kind of amazing that our current administration is kind of putting STEM under an environmental focus. Who would have thought? You would have expected it under career and technology or something like that. Well, what you find under career and tech or CTE, you're finding computer science, and that's cased under CTE. It's cased under Office of Innovation and Improvement. It's also cased under the military. Because these are what these departments need. And so what I would tell you is look at your policy, and it's amazing what policymakers will do for you. I had a program, I'm from Texas, so I should have started with that, I guess. I'm from Texas, and I work for a company called Westat. We're a big research firm, so we analyze trends, and we analyze where things are going on a national perspective. And in the state of Texas, I had an after-school program that we took a House representative on a tour, and they were doing a computer science curriculum. And the representative was like, I love this. Can you get a computer science curriculum that focuses on bullying? Kind of a, 2 stones. And I'm like, yeah, sure. So you find, you work with like PCS Edventures, and you're like, hey, is there something out there that does this? And they're like, sure, we have it right here. And so we did that, and he came back and he's like, great, I'm going to write a line item for it. And so next thing you know, there was a line item specifically for that software curriculum for that one program in his district.
Wow.
And if you've ever had line item funding, it's no strings attached, no,
That is a gift.
you have to follow the government guidelines, but it's written into the line until it's taken out. So until new legislation is proposed, it's continuing. So don't forget policy, because it can be huge, and keep track of what trends are going to be occurring. So if you look at the trends in the industry, I remember when the current administration proposed the idea of Space Force, and I was kind of laughing. I was like, finally, we have like Star Wars is going to happen. It's going to be crazy.
I love this whole trend, by the way, Shawn. I'm excited about it.
I was like, I could finally become a Jedi Knight or something. It'd be awesome.
I think we're going to have a camp coming up for it. This is what
I think you already might be a Jedi Knight.
Well, it was so exciting. But if you look at that, what you're starting to see is a focus on, drones in particularly, or the ability to fly unmanned crafts, whether it be a drone, an actual ship. We now have, I won't call them boats because that's an insult apparently, but ships on the ocean that are unmanned. And so all this is happening, and if you think about it, the funding will follow. So policy will set funding, and it's just being aware of it and pitching to your legislator saying, hey, I want to be the first one to introduce this maybe in an informal learning space like after school, and then it will embed itself in the school day. And then my last piece of advice I can give to everybody is something that both Kaitlin and Wendy talked about, and that is build the relationship with whoever your funder is or whoever your organization that you're working with is, and then share your success with the world. So as Kaitlin said, it may not necessarily be hard cash. Someone may not come in and say, hey, I got $10,000, here you go, an angel investor. But it could be someone saying, I don't necessarily have some cash right now, but I could support 6 individuals every week to mentor your students. I started a program in downtown Houston that had a local oil and gas company. They wouldn't give us any money, but they would give us a couple of mentors. And within 2 years, they started funding our entire robotics competition. So it's amazing how when you have the head of development volunteering in your school, all of a sudden the money follows, you know. So
circle right there.
you know, and it's all about taking pictures. There's nothing like, you know, make sure you get permission, of course, you know, but there's nothing better than going back to a funder and saying, look at this child, or look at the difference you're making. I captured it in a picture, I captured it in a video, and I put it to Louis Armstrong music or whatever it is. But you frame that moment. You have like that Disney, so to speak, or whatever type of am I allowed to say Disney? Sorry. You have that magical moment right there where people are like, oh, I want to give money to that, you know, and you're like, fine, I'll take your money and make it work really well. You know, so make sure you capture those relationships and share with the world. As Wendy said, I love Uber drivers because I have all these conversations with Uber drivers, and you'd be surprised at who drives Uber. You know, like there are pretty high up, sometimes executives driving Uber that are just trying to earn some extra cash for their children going to college or something. And so you're talking to them and they're like, oh, well, you know, during the day, I'm a distribution manager for such and such. And you're like, really? Would you come talk to my kids in my program? And so whether it's someone sitting next to you on the airplane or your Uber driver or someone you just meet in an elevator, build that relationship and see, and then work it into policy so that it becomes permanent.
You have to get your story out there. Without telling your story, no one else actually knows what's going on. So once you start to toot your own horn or tell your story, tell your student story, it is truly amazing to see the reflection and the aha moments that do come from that, because as Shawn stated, you're not sure who this person is connected to or the other person is connected to, and it does end up coming back full circle with the funding.
Absolutely. All right. So now it's time, we're going to take some time for questions. Does anyone have anything that they would like to ask our panel? And if so, as Renee stated earlier, I think you just want to write the question in the control box. Is that right?
That's right. There's a drop-down menu in your control panel that allows you to ask questions there. It looks like we have one here. So one of these educators says, this is a lot of great information, but how do I get started? What is the first thing I need to do in order to start this process?
I'll jump in and answer that. I sort of have 3 things I do myself and I tell others to do. So when you see a grant opportunity that you're interested in applying for, stop, get in a quiet area, and read through the whole grant call, because that's where you're gonna see, are you eligible for it? Is it gonna fund what you wanna fund? What are the requirements for that money? Because it's not free money. And then when the deadline is and what documentation you need for it. So I always close my office door, read through the whole call for the grant. The second thing I do is I let anybody else who needs to know that I am applying for this grant. So whether that's your business manager or someone else you want to collaborate with on this grant, just let them know that you're thinking about doing this so that they have the time to help you get what you need for that grant. And then the third thing I always do is I just do something, whether that's filling in my name or writing down a few notes about how I want to approach the grant, just get myself started, because it can be really overwhelming to just get going. So I do one thing so I know that I'm started, and I can move on from there.
And I like, and for example, the Idaho STEM Action Center has a grants portal. Mm-hmm. So just to register for an account to see, and that's exactly the same thing. I loved your comment on writing your name at the top of the paper. It really does. It gets you going, starting going. Yeah, for sure.
I would add to it as well, just, really make sure the grant matches what you really want to do. Mm. A lot of times we see, particularly in formal learning space, we see, we need cash to make things work. We need money to make things work. So we go after grants, but sometimes the grant really is a lot for what they're giving, so to speak. And so it's a matter of, as Kaitlin said, reading through it and then making sure your organization is really ready to do that.
Yeah.
If the grants requires you to do, like, let's say, augmented reality, do you really have the capacity to do it, or can you grow into it? And then you have to determine yourself, are you going to be a solo warrior? Are you going to be the one person who's championing this? Or are you going to have a team? And if it's only going to be you, make sure you're not a solo warrior for 20 initiatives.
Yeah.
And I'll go ahead and piggyback off of that as well. I probably should have started with this. I'm from Las Vegas. Woo woo, yes. And as Suzy stated, I work for a company called Communicate, Collaborate, Celebrate. And to piggyback off of what both Kaitlin and Shawn said, we believe that you should talk to each other. That's the communication part. The collaboration part is you don't necessarily need to carry your entire project on your shoulders as yourself. I know all of us like to believe that we have that beautiful S in this area and we are superhuman, but we don't necessarily need to keep that. So the collaboration piece, and then of course the celebration piece. Stop throughout the phases of writing the grant to actually check your own temperature, celebrate where you've come from, what you've done, what you've accomplished, what partnerships are already in place, and then use that information to pull it all back together. So basically from the conception all the way through sustainability, you need to have all of those things present where you're working together, you're communicating, and you are celebrating.
Would you also say, and I know with I keep bringing it back, but the Idaho STEM Action Center usually has a rubric for their grants. Do a lot of the grants, federal and state, have that as well? Something that you can go through and identify how you're going to be able to get scored?
Yes, and that is something that you definitely want to pay attention during the writing process. It will be the lingo that you want to know, the language, and the full looping of it. So if you mention something in one section, you want to make sure you touch base on the other, especially if there's a narrative piece. Many people will talk about their 17 field trips in the narrative, but forget to mention it in the actual body of the grant. So it should be a full closed circle. If you follow the rubrics step by step, you will be setting yourself up for success. Shawn, do you want to add anything?
Well, I was going to say, like a lot of the NSF grants or the IES, Institute of Education Science grants, the big like implementation grants that you go after, they'll usually even have like a call ahead of time. And what I've discovered from local programs is local programs sometimes are very scared to ask questions because they're like, oh, if I ask a goofy question, they're going to rate me differently. And that's not true. The entire reason they're having the call is to get all those questions out there. So, make sure.
Many of those calls have a deadline date too, so you will want to pay attention to it, where you can turn your questions in and they will respond to them. They also usually are required to post those responses. So if you aren't available to, or if you might not have a question because you're just starting and you're a little shy about diving in, I don't want to ask any questions yet. But it's always helpful to look up at the frequently asked questions, especially after they've held their meeting, so that you can make sure that you address all of the concerns.
The other thing that Wendy and, well, everybody on the panel basically has mentioned is that communicate with the people within your own, if you're in a school district or a school or whatever the case may be, make sure that you communicate with the people that the grant may affect and it has to be funded through a specific office or whatever the case may be. Make sure that those local administrators know that you're doing this and get their blessing on it, and they probably will even help you get it done because they want new things for their school as well. So, but make sure you communicate with them and get their support, and things will go much smoother.
Especially if you are partnering with a school agency or an LEA, a local agency, for reporting information with HERPA and HIPAA and FIPA and all those other fun laws in place. You don't want to commit yourself to showing student growth, and then you realize you don't have access to student growth. So you want to know ahead of time what you're going into before you promise on delivering something and then find out that legally you can't do that. So very good advice.
With that, we have another question here from an educator in Texas who writes in, what about Perkins funds? My district hasn't been applying for them lately, and I'm considering volunteering my time to complete the Perkins applications for our CTE programs. Any thoughts on that?
It also mentions they're a small rural school in Texas.
So
Perkins dollars, go ahead.
I was about to say they're in my neck of the woods, but I cut you off, Tim. I'm sorry.
That's why I said that, Shawn. So you.
Oh, well, Perkins is a very interesting grant because a lot of districts find themselves not going after it. And so I'd caution you on your own time, because as we've talked a lot about, many districts kind of have a plan, or they may not communicate it through the entire leadership structure of the district, but a lot of times they do have a plan, because Perkins requires like a workforce board to be engaged. It requires a local community to get some of the employers to come together in an advisory board. But I would say, definitely raise the awareness of it, because dollars like that, and this happens all the time in Texas particularly, we give money back to the federal government a lot. And so the comptroller's office has something called the transparency report. That's where you can see what money goes back, so you can check that and raise it up to your business development manager at the district, and then say, hey, can I get the district's blessings to go after this? And then read through the requirements and start to work on it. So I don't know that I would advise though going on your own though.
The Perkins funding is again based on the SES population that you have in your school district, and you can also quiz if you're in a small district, your superintendent and principal should have information about Carl Perkins. It is a grant that's available to every school district in the country. And it really isn't, it's not that difficult to access, but it does have requirements like everything else. So knowing what the requirements are and working with business and industry in your community. I wrote the Carl Perkins grant for our local district here for years. And it was sometimes taxing, but it was worth it to get new materials and exciting new information for kids and programs. And Perkins is easy to work with. It's a great opportunity for school districts to access some federal dollars.
And also feel free to contact us, and we're going to go through some contact information here soon, because we can help you with that process as well, depending on what you're looking for to add into your program. And in fact, I'll give out Jim's personal cell phone number.
He's
a celebrity around here.
She writes that on the walls and everything. It's really hard to get over.
So a somewhat related question here. A teacher mentions they're interested in purchasing a Discover STEM lab from PCS Edventures. And they're asking, how would you, Suzy, or other STEM ambassadors help them find money or funding so that they could get that into their library makerspace?
Absolutely. So first what we would do is go through a qualifying process. Find out exactly what you were interested in, the grade levels that you're working with, how many students at one time. Where are you? Are you in a rural area? Are you in a metropolitan area? What kind of connections do you have available within your school district? We would go through basically a full qualifying list of different funds that might be available to you, and I can lead you through that process. So we do it all the time. All of the STEM ambassadors are excellent at it as well, and so that's something where we can, I don't know, Renee, do you want to share information now on how to get in touch with those folks? So PCS Edventures, I'm on most of the West Coast territory in the Western states. We've also got Ben Moore, Peter Greer, Paula Life, and Luke Seaboard, and they would all be happy to share information with you. All you'll need to do is either email us at the Sales at Adventures, a really easy way to do it, or give us a call at the 1-800 number, and we can set up a special time to talk with you about your specific demographics within your area. A lot of times within the grant writing, I can help you formulate and put together a proposal based on what your STEM needs are. And then we really just comes from your demographics to write in for the grant portion of it. And so that's really been successful combination of other grantees that I've worked with, and we've won a lot of grants doing that. So it's easier than you think because you do have that information about your demographics, and once we can kind of fill in the holes with what materials you're looking for, it all comes together.
So thank you so much. I'd like to invite our audience to follow up, and there will be a quick survey at the end of this webinar as we exit. So I would encourage you all to please leave your response to help us improve these future webinars and get any resources to you. We'll be releasing this STEM grant writing white paper that has some tips if you're working on building a grant proposal that will be sent to you along with the recording of this webinar once you fill out that survey. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.